But Penfolds Grange very nearly never happened. It all began in 1950 when Penfolds chief winemaker Max Schubert was sent to Europe to study advances in winemaking. Not in red winemaking at all, in fact, but in sherry and fortified production. Penfolds Grange was inspired by accident. It was only a chance visit to Bordeaux en route to Portugal that Max Schubert was motivated to create this red wine. And the story goes he was designing it in his head on the way back to Australia on the plane. A red wine with the complexity, intensity and structure of Bordeaux that would live for 20 years. Little did he know it at the time, it would in fact live for 50 and counting. Max Schubert returned to Australia in 1951, and in that very first vintage since his return, he was to create the very first experimental vintage of Penfolds Grange. Not from the Bordeaux variety of Cabernet, but from Australia's trump card of Shiraz, built on a core of vineyards that his ancestors and others on those very first ships from Germany planted in none other than the Barossa Valley. And he was to create Grange using techniques he'd learnt in Bordeaux, techniques completely foreign to Australia at the time, things like fermenting in oak barrels, using new oak rather than old, and tricks for extracting colour and tannin and structure from these wines like Australia had never known before. Techniques that are commonplace across Australian winemaking to this day, yet at the time were completely controversial. And so vintage followed vintage in the 1950s, and just after the 1956 vintage, it seemed the time was ripe to announce this wondrous thing to the world for the first time. Representative samples of every vintage from 1951 were assembled. Invited guests included well-known Sydney wine identities, friends of the board, and top management of Penfolds. It was to be the first ever tasting of the wine that would become more famous than any other in Australia, and any other, indeed, in the Southern Hemisphere. What a moment. But the result took them by complete surprise. It completely and utterly backfired. In Max Schubert's own words, it was a complete and utter disaster. Quite simply, no one liked Penfolds Grange. One well-known Sydney wine identity at the time said, "Schubert, I congratulate you. A very good dry port which no one in their right mind will buy, let alone drink." The final blow came just before the 1957 vintage, when Schubert received written instructions from Penfolds management to cease production of Penfolds Grange altogether. The reasons given? He was accumulating wines that were, to all intents and purposes, unsaleable, and that the adverse criticism brought against the company as a result of the comments on this wine was detrimental. It seemed this was the end for Penfolds Grange. But not for Max Schubert. With the support of Geoffrey Penfold Hyland, he continued production in complete secrecy. Without access to new oak, he used old oak barrels, and he bottled it in bottles he found discarded in the cellars under Penfolds McGill estate here in the suburbs of Adelaide. He even famously walled up the end of one of those drives to hide the accumulating stock out of sight of the authorities for the hidden vintages of 1957, 1958 and 1959. In all, it would be 10 years from the very first vintage until Penfolds Grange matured enough that Penfolds management started to look at it and understand what was going on, and gave Schubert written word again in 1960 to recommence production. Since that time, Penfolds Grange has not looked back. In 1979, Schubert wrote, "I wish to express the hope that the production and acceptance of Penfolds Grange as a great Australian wine has proven that we in Australia are capable of making wines equal with the best in the world." In the years to follow, the 1955 vintage alone would win more than 50 gold medals in Australian wine shows. Those earliest vintages, deemed unsaleable by Penfolds management in 1957, are now priceless. In 2008, an Australian record auction price was set by a single 750ml bottle of that very first vintage of 1951, which sold for $53,936. Sometimes you have no idea just what a difference you can make. And sometimes you'll never ever know. Max Schubert died in 1994 here in Adelaide, just months before Penfolds Grange was made world famous by Wine Spectator magazine. He would never know the full depth and impact of the legacy that he would leave.